Welcome, and good day, good morning, good evening, whatever time it is in your part of the world. This is our fourth challenge briefing on evaluating ideas. For those who are new, you can get the first three briefings on our YouTube channel and actually on our website. I will put those in the links in our chat, general chat, so you can see that. This is based on the idea that you've been through a number of sessions and developed some ideas. Obviously, not all of you will, but this will give you the idea. And the key is to try and work out what do you think matters first, what problems, what people need in terms of solutions to the multiple challenges faced, what also you're motivated with, and then develop lots of ideas. And that happened in we discussed developing ideas in the last session. And here we're going to, Dave is going to talk about how you evaluate those ideas. So there'll be more time to think, obviously, and there's still time to develop ideas, but this is obviously a very important stage of the whole process. So I'll leave it to Dave Jarman, our resident briefer and senior lecturer at the University of Bristol, to take it from here. Thanks very much, Dave.
Thank you, Henry. So obviously, if people are still in the process of kind of developing ideas or kind of even thinking through the problems that they want to tackle, that's absolutely fine. In some ways, these briefings are really just a way of presenting you with a methodology. And whilst in a sense, we might be showing you steps that you haven't got to yet. That's fine. Hopefully you've distilled a method that you can continue to use as and when you do get to it. Today's session is kind of interesting because we're going to be starting to share some of the principles by which we might evaluate ideas. And there is a danger that if you kind of have too many of these in mind too early in the process, it kind of rather constrains the idea generation process. But fundamentally, at some point, you will always encounter some of these criteria anyway. So let's get on with the session itself. So what we're going to try and cover this morning is around how do we kind of converge back down on finding the right idea, and talking about some of the criteria that we might use to select ideas. But then again, addressing this in the context of the challenge and thinking about how this will kind of step on to the next session. So to remind us, obviously, we're in this non-linear innovation process, and we're trying to find the right thing to do before we try and make the thing right. And it is knotty. You will find yourself kind of getting a number of steps through the process and going, you know what, actually, I don't think I've really tackled the right problem, or it transpires that nobody wants this, or maybe this wasn't quite the right way to solve it. And that's absolutely fine. You know, one of the ideas that we've hopefully started to talk about is this idea of kind of fast failure. So in the process of generating ideas, you're going to make lots of missteps. You're going to make lots of mistakes. You're going to run into and bump into lots of dead ends. And that's fine. That's to be expected. Like, this isn't a linear process. So actually, whenever you do bump into something and you think, you know what, actually, I have to take a few steps back, or actually, I'm not ready for this yet, that's fine. It's just feedback. It's just feedback that makes you and your ideas better for having kind of been enriched by going backwards a few paces and just thinking about how you might move that forward in the right way. So remember, we're also in this double diamond model. You know, we've been exploring problems, kind of finding inspiration, finding insights, gathering data that helps us get insight into what the problems really are and what the nature of the problem really is. So, you know, what is it? Who suffers it? Why is it a problem? You know, these are the things that we might have been thinking about, and then kind of defining down to go, right, this is the question that we're trying to solve. This is the thing that we want to do something about. And only then generating the possible solutions to that. So only then asking me, and how are we going to do this? And one of the things that we talked about in the last session that might be that real focus right at the heart there is that idea of a how might we question. So how might we do X for Y better than Z? So converging on an idea that we've generated that actually looks like it might work. So there's been a number of studies in this area, but one that I kind of come back to again and again is this idea that for one successful launch of an idea, you might have had 3,000 raw ideas or hunches that led to that process. So you often have to start with an awful lot of spare parts, an awful lot of hunches and insights and iterations, and some of them some of those hunches become an idea. Some of those ideas you might work up as a sort of basic model to see if it works. Some of those basic models might actually become a plan. Some of those plans might even get launched. And actually within the study that gave us this rough visual, actually there were 2 launches and only one of them was a success. So actually all the way through this process, there's an awful lot of things that we're putting to one side that fundamentally go no further or have been synthesized into the greater whole. So we're gradually kind of whittling those options down based on evidence to find something that really works. So in terms of actually then evaluating the ideas that we've got. So one thing is actually to go back to the kind of clustering method. Now we used the clustering method initially just to synthesize our insights and ideas, but actually we can use it again when we've got a group of ideas and we go, actually, are these all the same idea? Are these variations on a theme? Or is there something more fundamental within these ideas that's important? And that these are all effectively just, suits of clothing for the same core idea. Because it might be that actually when you put a group of ideas up, you go, you know what? Actually, there's an underlying principle. There's an underlying mechanism that is true of all of these ideas. And that might help. It doesn't necessarily help you decide which one to do, but just noticing that you've got a real kind of cluster of related concepts is important. And then you might move into some sort of criteria-based testing. So there's a very kind of crude one there about kind of selecting what kind of a holiday to go on. And we're all familiar with these processes. So, we have a number of different options that we might take, and we might specify a number of criteria, and we score against those criteria. We might even weight some of the criteria as more important than others. And this is where actually you're almost going back to the start of the process. You're almost going back to, well, what do you think is important? What's valuable to you? Or when you think about your users, when you think about your stakeholders, what's the most important thing to them? Because different ideas will deliver value in different ways. Some will be all about convenience. Some will be all about the scale of impact and the number of people. Some of them will be about the depth of the impact and the transformational outcome that is likely to happen to an individual. Go back and think about, actually, when you're trying to create your criteria, what's the information that you're using to generate that criteria? Because actually, there's no point in just making spurious criteria up. Actually, you want to think back to your research to go, what have I been told is important? And surely I should make my decision based on my users and my stakeholders and what they think is important. Or what an expert view might say is most likely to achieve a particular kind of impact. So I'm going to offer you some frameworks, some potential criteria. Now, as I said, you should go back and refer to the research that you've done and your users, but here are some kind of more, kind of generic frameworks that might just give you some food for thought. So one of them is based around the work of Osterwalder and Pigneur, and their work around the business model canvas, started in business model generation and continued in value proposition design. And they talk about this idea of 3 types of fit. So the idea that you've got that solves a problem, it fits on paper in that you've got what we call a problem solution fit. And then it seems to work in principle. Like maybe in your group, sat around your table, you kind of, yeah, that seems to make sense. That looks like that would be an answer to that particular problem. When you're kind of reasoning it out on a whiteboard, yeah, okay, on paper, in principle, that looks like it's an answer. Great, okay, so you've got a problem solution fit, but it's not robust, it's not proven. So the next type of fit is that it fits in the market. So there's what we call a product market fit. So there's evidence that actually customers want it, that actually you've got people turning around and saying, yeah, that is a solution to my problem. your users, your stakeholders actually say, yeah, no, I'd buy that, I'd use it, I'd participate in it, I'd do that, that would make a difference. Whatever your standard of evidence is for this will make a difference, you've got some evidence that this is happening. And that's usually gained through an iterative process of testing and validating it. You've taken it out to a number of people and they've all said yes. That, you can say, 8 out of 9 respondents said yes, this would be the kind of thing that they'd like to do. You might require a number of pivots to find something that actually people want to do. But this is the process of moving it from being on paper to being it actually works in practice. Now, the issue here is that, yes, it is working for some people, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily working for enough people, and it doesn't necessarily mean that your means of making the idea happen are actually viable. That just because you can make it and people want it, it doesn't mean you've got a business. You could end up with what I sometimes refer to as a very expensive hobby, in that you're making something or you're doing something fundamentally at a loss in a way that's unsustainable. So, the idea of a charity that does great things but only lasts a year because actually it's not generating enough resource to keep doing it. And there's a real danger here that we create amazing things that don't last and that actually don't solve a problem, or they solve it temporarily. It's like a sticking plaster when you've lost your arm. So how do we find something that is actually impactful over time and is sustainable? Well, that's our third type of fit. So in the entrepreneurship model, crudely, it's referred to as the fit. It fits in the bank. That actually there's a business model here. There's evidence of a route to the market, that actually you can get something to your users, and that actually it's sustainable. You can get enough back to allow you to keep doing it. And that's important because it avoids us being one-hit wonders. So actually, there may even be opportunities here to grow it still further. But you can start to see that there are these kind of tiers of evidence. Yeah, it works on paper. Yeah, a few people actually said that they really like this and they want to do something about it. Actually, we've got a plan that allows us to build it, to grow it, to develop it, and to keep it going. Great stuff. That's a great place to get to. So that's one framework. Here's another. And this is the one that I often use when I first look at ideas and I first encourage my students to look at ideas. And it's simply just to map it out. That I've got all these different potential ideas that I could do something about. And do they have impact? Do they actually make a difference? Do they actually change the thing that I want to see changed? We all want to change the world. Does this idea actually change the world? Does it have impact? And we might map its kind of impact from kind of low to high. And then we might look at it, say its feasibility, like how easy is it to do? Because actually, if it's impossible to do, that's quite tricky. And equally, if it's kind of low impact, it doesn't really make much of a difference, but it's kind of easy to do, then, well, it's just practically throw it away. Now, you can substitute all kinds of criteria on an axis like this to start judging between your ideas. But I find impact and feasibility to be two good ones. And you can see in the image on the right-hand side there, this idea of trying to map your ideas, and you're looking for the kind of the high impact, like this will be genuinely transformational, and the highly feasible. Actually, you can do these. You can do these with the resources that you have. And it's the image suggests that the best ideas are in that top right corner. I would actually contend that there was a better spot on that graph for an idea, and it's at the top. It's right at the top of the diagram, but it's kind of in the middle, in that it's highly impactful, but it's only moderately feasible. And the reason I say that actually that's better is because if it's moderately feasible, it means that not necessarily everybody can do it, and that if you were looking for something where you wanted to establish some sort of competitive advantage, having something that's too easy to do actually is a problem for an entrepreneur, because it means you're too easy. It's too easily copied. Now, if you're thinking activism, if you're thinking kind of policy, if you're thinking kind of charitable activity, and actually you don't mind copycats turning up and doing what you do because actually that generates more impact, then great. Make it as easy as you can. But I think you should always be thinking about, how do I make my idea maybe more impactful or more feasible, if that's important, or less feasible, so that actually you can establish competitive advantage. The best thing is to find something that's really super feasible for you because of your skills, networks, and contacts, but is actually difficult for anyone else because they don't have the same skills, networks, and contacts. But yeah, just one way of starting to think about, I've got all these different ideas, which ones should I do? A similar kind of matrix approach, and you'll find a PDF tool for this one, is the, again, borrowed from Board of Innovation, is the How, Now, Wow matrix. And this sets up two axes for you to contemplate. One of them is effectively a feasibility one, in that it's how easy is it to implement? Is it easy or is it impossible? And how innovative is the idea? How new and interesting is it? And effectively, if you've got something that's easy to implement, but it's kind of average, then just get on with it. You know, this is something that you can do now. If it's impossible to implement, but it's really innovative, then you have to work out how to do it. And if it's easy to implement and it's innovative, then that's wow. And that's probably the priority to work on. And actually, if it's an average idea that's very difficult to implement, I probably wouldn't worry about it. But again, all just ways to sift through your ideas. And again, this speaks to the value of, you know, the post-it note or the virtual post-it note, that, you know, you've got lots of ideas scribbled down, and then you can move them and map them easily. And then you can also think about how they iterate, because you can go, oh, okay, well, what would be a more exciting version of this? Or what would be a more feasible version of this? And you can start to unpack from there. So whilst we talked about this idea that in a way you're kind of converging back and making a decision, there are also opportunities here that if you're bumping into difficulties and thinking this isn't going to work, you can diverge again and generate new options and then come back. So this process is intended to be an agile process. So just building on that idea of criteria, some of the classics that I certainly talk about a lot when I'm looking at kind of helping my students change the world, helping my students think about the ideas they want to bring forward. The three terms that I almost always come back to are, can you prove it's desirable? Can you prove that enough people actually seem to want it and seem to want it more than the existing alternatives? Is it feasible? Actually, does it work? Does it make a difference? Does it have an impact? Does it have enough of a difference? But then also this idea of viability. Actually, do the profits, and I don't just mean kind of financial profits, but the sort of profits in goodwill, in a job well done, in intellectual or cultural or social value created or environmental value that have been created, do they outweigh the cost of doing it? So, you know, when you think about putting your money or your time or your love into anything, you hope that it will multiply. You don't necessarily want to see that kind of wasted, or you'll think I could probably use my resources differently. So when you're thinking about an idea to invest in, viability is important because you want it to last, you want it to grow, you want it to scale. So actually thinking this through, and then you've got equally one way of framing it is to think about, you know, the people, the technology that you're using, and the business here. And I use business as a very kind of generic term for a vehicle for an idea that can be sustained. Now, we all know, if we've seen TV programs like kind of Dragon's Den or Shark Tank, we all know that just because it looks like it's desirable, it seems to be feasible, and it seems to be viable, those ideas don't always necessarily get picked, get championed, and get invested anyway. Because actually, when someone pitches us an idea, actually we're also judging the human. We're also evaluating the people who proposed the idea, and we're making a judgment about how authentic they are, like how committed are they? Do they seem to have the competence to do this? Because it's a great sounding idea. I don't know if they're actually quite the right people. And the credibility, like, do we think they can do it? And talking to an awful lot of venture capitalists and investors down the years, actually, they all say, you know, I invest in people. You know, the ideas are important, but I invest in the people. And if a great group of people with a slightly not brilliant idea come forward, they may still get invested in the hope that they will come up with a better idea. Whereas actually, even if they've got a brilliant idea, but they don't seem credible and they don't seem authentic and they don't seem committed, actually they won't get investment because the investors don't believe that they can do it. and this isn't just true of investors, this is true of kind of lots of different forms of kind of stakeholder and supporter of a project. Now, yeah, I have to apologize here for the dreadful image. However, one of the things that I have heard angel investors and venture capitalists say again and again and again to me down the years is that they will back people who will run through walls. And this particular phrase has been used on countless occasions so often that I've adopted it myself. And what they mean is that they want to back people who really want to make something happen, who are prepared to run through walls to make it happen. They don't like backing people who go, you know what, I could do this. And the minute that they get bad feedback, they go, oh, okay, I won't do that. That looks too difficult. I'm not going to bother. They like to back the people who almost sort of stubbornly insist that they will do it despite the feedback. Now, there's a balance to be struck here between being open to feedback, being skeptical about feedback, and being a bloody minded idiot. If I knew where the line was in all of that, I'd be a much richer man than I am. But just think about that idea of not only thinking about how good the idea is, but whether actually you want to commit to doing it and whether actually you can put a credible team together. Because the other piece here is that even if you're thinking you might not have all of this yourself, can you build a team around you? Can you get supporters around your idea that look like they add to credibility? Now, if you're a young person, the thing that you actually often you might struggle to have with some of these ideas is credibility, because you may lack a kind of experience or kind of apparent wisdom. But if you can get some people who've got those qualities to endorse your idea, actually that's great, and you've got credibility. So, you know, the mentors in this program may be very useful to you for that reason alone. So equally, how do you prove this commitment? So you'll find that I like diagrams with overlapping circles. So there's a chap called David Hyatt. He was the guy who part-founded the Howie's clothing brand. He's now the guy responsible for the Do Lectures series in Wales and online. He was at Saatchi & Saatchi earlier in his career. He's written some great stuff. But one of the things that I like about his work most is he wrote a book called Do Purpose. In fact, I have it right here, Do Purpose. And in that book is this diagram. And he talks about finding something that is at the intersection between the things that you love doing, the things that you're good at doing, your skill, and the zeitgeist. And what he means by the zeitgeist is the thing that everybody else seems to want right now. And if you can find something that you're good at, that you love doing, and that other people seem to want, brilliant. Now, I've also done some work in this area as well, and some of this is at my blog. One of my research areas is people's entrepreneurial side projects. And what makes a good side project in my research is demonstrated by something that they've got a personal passion for doing, that they've got some, not all, professional competence in doing, but it's also something that they want to do more of tomorrow. But again, you're starting to see just this idea of how you might think about finding something that actually you're really interested in committing to. Now, just to add one more circle, this is the Japanese concept of ikigai. So apparently translates as a reason for being. And again, it's this mix of finding something that you love doing, finding something that you're good at doing, finding something that the world needs, and finding something that you can be paid for. And at different points in your life, you will find different combinations of this, because trying to get all 4 bits all of the time is next to impossible. But it's worth looking for, but thinking about how you can kind of connect these things up. So, credibility. So the way that I think about credibility is I think about people's performance over time. So at any given moment in time, so here's today, I'm looking, when I make a judgment about somebody's credibility, to get a sense of their trajectory. Now, whether you are listening to somebody pitch an idea, whether you are watching somebody present to you at a job interview, you're making a decision based on what you can see of their past history, their past trajectory, to see if they're going to continue to accelerate from today. Like if I employ you, if I back your idea, I want to see it continue upwards. It also means that I'm kind of unlikely to back somebody whose performance has been dragging along the bottom until now. Even if what they're going to tell me is that they're going to dramatically improve, the trajectory suggests that's possibly not true. So you're looking for something that just suggests trajectory. So getting some experience, generating a few ideas, trying a few things, even if they fail, actually, if you've shown commitment and willingness to try things and learn things and do things, actually that's really good evidence that you will continue to do those things. And those are kind of highly rated in terms of me wanting to employ somebody or me wanting to invest in an idea. So think about how you evidence your track record. One other thing I'll just kind of add to that idea is this idea of finding a competitive edge. Now, there's an organization called Entrepreneur First, and they put teams together around really interesting kind of largely technology ideas to create new startups. And they blogged about it, and you can see the link to the blog there. But they talk about trying to find teams that have both a deep problem knowledge, they really understand what they're trying to solve, and they have advanced skills. And this gives them edge, as they put it, rather than, for example, people with a kind of limited knowledge of a problem and limited skills to address it, because that feels unlikely to shift. So just think about where you might find something that speaks to both the things that you understand and the things you're good at doing. So you'll find a whole bunch of additional resources to support some of this stuff. The Straight Up Business Institute has got a whole bunch of really great tools for looking at ways of measuring a kind of a startup idea. So back to the challenge context. Now, hopefully after Tuesday, you might have some solutions to the problems that you're working on. You might have some possibilities. And actually now you're in the business of evaluating which ones of those to take forward. If you're further back in the process of that and you're still trying to work out what it is that you want to do, that's fine. But actually what we've given you today is some sense of the criteria that you might use. And you might still have a useful discussion in the workshop about the kinds of criteria that are relevant to you in terms of kind of selecting the ideas that you want to work on. So next Tuesday, Henry is going to be delivering the session. He might say more about that in just a moment, but we're going to start talking a little bit about thinking like a system and understanding your idea in the context of a system. And then I'll be picking up the baton again next Thursday and thinking about how you might act on it like an entrepreneur. So in a minute, we'll pick up some questions, but I will just flag up what we're going to try and get to in the workshop, which was thinking about the criteria by which you want to assess your ideas, thinking about whether you can test your ideas against any of those criteria. And even if that's just impact and feasibility, and it's a very simple map, great. If you want to do desirability, feasibility, viability, great. If you want to add in authenticity or credibility or whatever other criteria you want to use, fine. And at that point, you might want to go back and revisit the value propositions you might have from the tail end of last week, where we talked about this idea of the ad lib and what are you going to do for who? Now, that was your framing of the problem in a way. So actually now, and that was your framing of the user and what they were trying to get done. Now, when you look at this solution that you've selected, you just want to go back and double check. Does this solve that? And that's just a really good way of just double checking that you've done something that you think is going to have that impact. Or you might need to iterate. It's entirely possible. However, I am going to draw myself to a stop there and we'll hand over for some Q&A.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Dave. I think it's really interesting, this fact that, investors always say they invest in the person. And there's a fascinating contrast, I always think, with the way that government give grants or invest in the public sector, if you like, because they usually do it by people having to provide detailed plans with indicators and assessment and accountability, etc., etc. And actually the nature of the person or the organization or whatever, doesn't figure much. And so anyone can generate a spreadsheet and produce some numbers, and the future is so uncertain that actually relying on them, even with a certain level of research is problematic.
Well, it's interesting. There is a tension here because obviously, any kind of public procurement process that needs to be reasonably kind of transparent has this sense. Well, actually, we're going to ask you these. We're going to ask you all the same questions. We're going to expect you all to have the same standards of evidence, And it does turn into quite a bureaucratic process. And I do always find it quite fascinating when I talk to kind of angel investors, that actually it's much more about meeting a person, getting a sense of it, making a kind of a decision. And you kind of make a decision, and only then do you go through the sort of the due diligence of just checking whether that investment actually is the right thing to do. And I think there are real barriers to small organizations and startups pitching for kind of particularly government and public money because of the thresholds that are put in place. However, what's also always been apparent to me is that if you know some of the right people in those procurement processes to talk to, it's not that you can shortcut the process, but you can have a set of conversations and you can get a degree of support from them that encourages you to put your ideas in or helps you shape that idea because they want to see it. And I think where you can build relationships with people and they get that sense of the passion and the commitment and the competence, actually you can find an idea getting championed for a system. I think a lot of these measures, desirability, feasibility, viability, are at the heart of a lot of those procurement processes. I remember working with a student who had a really high-tech idea that he was trying to get into a defence academy incubator scheme. And we were thinking, oh, God, I wonder what the criteria were going to be for getting money from the MOD. And actually their criteria were desirability, feasibility and viability. And that actually they had to make a case against all of those three things. And that was the start of the process.
But interesting, that's not about the person, is it? But I think it would be possible, I mean, for government to look more at what are the purposes of this organization? What is the institution? Who's involved in it? Is there a diversity of people? Do they have the capacities? And maybe, you know, how public purpose orientated are they? And it's interesting actually that government's gone away from that because it's sort of said in the past, well, private sector good. And so it probably feels unable to question, you know, whereas we see with all the procurement that government's being taken for a ride because big businesses have found ways of milking government, basically. And if that, because that's their motivation, you know, they're maximizing profits. They're not actually about delivering services at all. And they just move from one procurement project to another to keep the cash flow going. And then every now and again, they fall over. Anyway, that's my hobby. I think we are beginning to see a growing awareness that it's not that the bottom line, the economic bottom line of making a particular decision in a particular way actually doesn't necessarily help us. And that actually this idea in sort of social enterprise of the sort of triple bottom line and the idea that maybe it's not just kind of like getting the job at the right price, but it's getting the right kind of organization to do the right job at a decent price actually is more important. Now, you know, governments will always kind of make some poor decisions. I mean, we can see some interesting procurement going on in the midst of COVID right now with government contract. But part of that is kind of understanding the rationale and the relationships of some of the people involved in the process. And that can be made to work for good as much as it can be made to work for ill. However, what it doesn't escape is that whenever we're judging ideas, these are the kinds of criteria that we tend to apply when we're making decisions, like, do people want it? Because I think one of the big things that's come out of the sort of design movement is that we used to just really think about judging ideas in terms of, well, does it work? And is there a business model? And we didn't tend to think, actually, do people want it? And is this what they want? And this is how they want it? And desirability's kind of really gone up the rankings. But the other thing that I notice when I work with students is that if I'm working with engineering students, they just talk about feasibility. If I talk to students from other disciplines, they might talk about desirability as well. But actually, we also need to think about viability. And even if it's a charity event, it may need to economically wash its face. Well, I always find it very irritating that people say, you know, I'm not a charity or something, as if charities were about giving lots of things away. But you know, of course, if you are a not-for-profit organization, you still have to get resources. And actually, you know, as a not-for-profit organization, the process of applying for grants is hugely grueling and actually very dispiriting as well, because you rarely get any feedback. So it's very, very tough. getting resources for charities. It's not giving, it's not somehow an easy option. It's as difficult, I think, to get, maybe more difficult to get resources as a not-for-profit as a private organisation. And you do.
I mean, charities are harder to run. I mean, you've not just got the economic bottom line, you've also got to prove that you're doing the social good that you set out to do.
So it's anyway, one of the frustrations. Let's go. We've got one question. Will we be able to pitch some initial ideas to the group? Leonie and I have a suggestion on how to generate more ideas. Leonie might feel comfortable pitching it. Well, I was thinking about this because as Dave was saying, and I think we've observed, people are at different stages in terms of their thinking and development. And maybe we could divide the tables in the workshop between people who want to do different things. So there might be people who have yet to really get an idea, think what their idea is, not sure, want some help sort of over the whole sort of process. And there might be others who, have some ideas they want to pitch and test and go through an evaluation process with. And maybe we could sort of separate people into those different groups on different tables with different mentors acting to either support actually the earliest stages, taking people again through trying to think what matters to them, what matters to the world, what they care about, and then generate ideas against them, as opposed to other people who have some ideas that they could evaluate, they could discuss, whether they're going to work on another table as well. So hopefully that will help. Any other questions about the actual topic of evaluation, or was that all fairly clear? I'm putting up, there's a number of resources links that I've been putting up as we've been, as Dave's been presenting. So I will get those up, and a copy of this, the presentation and discussion and so forth in the next, in the sort of next short period. Not a question. There's a table I was on yesterday, which it would be good if the earlier process bit could nab, as that has some ideas on it we'd like to continue generating from. Okay, so is that on the, that's on the whiteboard, there are some ideas. Well, maybe that would be, I don't know who was involved in that. It might be good to try and work out, because I suppose people have to come with ideas. But I suppose people can nick and develop other people's ideas, and there's nothing wrong with that. Maybe, Adam, you could go to the table and download the whiteboard with the ideas on, and then you can always upload it to another whiteboard, or at least use it to introduce it to discussion.
The use of taking screenshots in this era, I found very useful. I work with colleagues on a whiteboard or on some things on a screen, and I just print screen using my keyboard on a number of occasions. It just means I've got a kind of a visual record of stuff that I can kind of take from meeting to meeting. I mean, one of the things that we haven't particularly talked about here in particular that's really vital in any innovation process is fundamentally note-taking, which might seem really obvious, but the amount of stuff that we forget is unbelievable. And if actually I could only remember half of the good ideas that I've ever had, I'd be doing very well. So note taking. Just off screen here, I've always got post-it notes for scribbling things down on. They go, oh yeah, I must remember that. Right, okay. And
if you want to sort of go and try and remember your thoughts, you can go back over the resources and the previous presentations as well, as they are there for you.
Absolutely. I mean, something that just to maybe kind of tie together some of the discussion here is, certainly in the process of working with lots of students down the years, that they always get very hung up on finding the right idea. There isn't a right idea, and I think that's really important. There's lots of ideas, and some of them may prove to have more impact than others. And actually, the trick here is to try and do some things, because even an unpromising idea might turn into something with a few iterations that actually works really well. I mean, these might not be the best examples, but have a look at some of the biggest companies around us in the world. Facebook started as a hot or not website at a university. You know, if I'd have seen this as a university lecturer, as a student presenter, I wouldn't have thought it was going to go anywhere. I wouldn't have thought that was a good idea. But I mean, maybe I don't even think it's a good idea now. But it's iterated into.
And I think, sorry.
And I think that's always something to bear in mind, that, you know, poor and silly ideas will be stepping stones to better ideas. Actually, the critical thing is to act, because if it's just an idea, actually it's not doing a thing. It's only when you act on the idea and you try and make it do something that you find out what it can do, and you also find out how to make it better. So rather than get too stuck in the process of trying to find the perfect idea, I would always be thinking about, how do I act and move forward? You know, one of the mantras that we have in our academic centre is progress, not perfection. You can spend a lot of time looking for perfection. Actually, what you want to do is just make some progress.
And I think on top of that, Dave, I'd say you get attention to some extent by having a shared why, and then people will work with the what. And I'm going to talk a bit about that around systems thinking as well, in that because actually you need to learn from others, and people will work with you and give you feedback and help you if they agree that the why is really, this really matters, this is important, something needs to be done, there is a problem that needs solving. And if they see you are motivated to try and solve it, possibly going through walls, willing to go through walls or whatever, they will then help you think through your ideas, give you some tips and so forth. And they'll also introduce you to some other people who are shared by the why. So what unites people is a common sense of the problem and something needs to be done, not the solution necessarily, though that may happen down the track as people become more embedded and supportive of the solution. So yes, being really committed, having motivation, really caring about the problem, and finding other people who do as well with different experience, expertise, etc., and obviously a few ideas to get started, you know, can really get you motoring. Because unless you have a discussion, you're stuffed.
Yeah, and that's why, you know, within this process we focus so much on the problem, because actually it's a common place to go back to. That actually, if you can agree what the problem is, and you know that is kind of robustly validated by having spoken to people, you can unify people around a problem in a way that actually sometimes when you come forward with a solution, there's a sense in which the person who came forward with the solution, whether they exert it or not, has an ownership. And then other people are either also owners of that, or they're not owners of that, and they feel more or less committed as a result. Whereas actually it's the cause that kind of unifies people. And actually, even when your idea isn't working, your solution isn't working, you can kind of go back to the problem and go, well, I still know that this is a problem, and I still know that this needs doing, and I can come up with other solutions. And it's also why we talk so much about kind of solution agnosticism, that, you know, let's not get too hung up about the how. Let's go back and think, well, why is this a problem? Who is it a problem for? And what specifically is that problem? And I think if we can keep working on that, more ideas will turn up over time. But that's why the problem is at the crux of all of this sort of design methodology.
I think as long as people see that you're learning, people will, you know, I mean, take for instance what we're trying to do at Promoting Economic Pluralism. I mean, we're trying to do something that a lot of people think is impossible. It fails the viability test, you know, that to change how people think about the economy, to change the dominance of economic thinking, teaching, analysis by mainstream economists using a particularly narrow way of thinking. They are huge. They're the Goliath. You know, they're absolutely, you know, they are everywhere. They seem to dominate everything. But there are enough people who think that's a problem. That is a really, really, really big problem. That gives you a lot of space to try and experiment and see what happens, what works. Because they know, people have been, I mean, the first person I talked to about this, one of the early people, he said, you know, I've been banging my head against this wall for the last 50 years and got nowhere. I've gone off and done something else. But, you know, people know it's incredibly difficult, but incredibly important. So people there will have forgiveness, I hope, for a level of failure or, you know, as long as you're learning, trying to do better, keeping people in touch. The people they will desert is people who are not listening, who are obsessed with one idea and just don't change, and they give up on them because it's dull and boring and they're not going to get anywhere. So you have to be part of the game. You've got to, be part of the discussion, be part of doing something to get anywhere. That is really what it's about. There was a question, by the way, under the Q&A, which was, can we identify which tables for where people are in their sort of process of thinking? Yes, we will do that at the beginning of the next session. We are coming to the end of this session, and people do need a little bit of a break and so forth. So any final questions? Hi, Miguel. Welcome. Or have you just pushed the wrong button?
No, sorry, because you were about to finish. Are you listening to me?
Yes.
Okay. And I write in English not that fast, so I didn't want to waste this. Sorry.
Okay.
Dave spoke about Facebook, and as far as I remember, Facebook was born because the founders wanted to use it. Okay, there was not a project that they want to evaluate or something. And here, I think it's the same in economy. We have to find the place to understand what do we want to achieve? How do we want to trade? How do we want to relate as entrepreneurs with our employees, or as an employee with an entrepreneur? All those relationships, it's not about a project. It's not about something that has to be evaluated. It's about ourselves,
But can it be both and? Because you're right, that I suppose if you want to spend time having coffee with people and wandering around, etc., then that's about you, but it's not a project, probably.
No, it's about gathering people. I mean, of course, you have to put to understand what do you want to change, what and how would you like to live, and after that, having some common issues, start developing and the possible solutions, and then you went to the process that we in some way learned today, or we had today. But first, we have to understand ourselves. What do we want to change? I mean, we have to agree on that first.
Yeah, and in a way, that's the basis of some of the earlier content about finding a job that people want doing, finding a problem that needs solving, and then actually if you've got that, and then you've got a set of ideas, you can evaluate those ideas based on how well they respond to the problem that you've identified. And actually, your Facebook founders were trying to do a very particular thing. They wanted a service, a platform for accomplishing a particular task. And they built something that did that, and then they realized it could do other things, and then they kind of validated that those other things were things that people wanted to do, and then they validated that it wasn't just interesting to students at one university, it was interesting to lots of students, and then it was interesting to people who weren't even students. And now Facebook is dominated by demographics that actually are not students.
Absolutely.
And students are going somewhere else to do new jobs to be done. So a lot of this goes back into some of the value creation and kind of value proposition stuff that we talked about earlier, about this idea of kind of jobs to be done, identifying what they are, identifying the pains and gains, and then how well a service responds to that. So hopefully, by framing that problem, by framing what needs doing by a particular user, and then generating ideas in response, we can evaluate those ideas based on that initial.
But there is this, I'm going to talk about this next week as well, the sort of why, how, and what. And in a way, we've talked about why, and we're talking about what, and the actual how, because, there is a big question is, do you want to be a social, do you want to do this in a certain way through a collaborative, social, non-profit, purpose-driven way, or do you want to do it in a way that tries to make you as much money as possible? And that is that is what sort of person are you? What do you care about? What, in terms of how you relate and your morality and so forth. And that's probably an important step, which is sort of implicit in what we've been talking about, but because there are these options, but actually is a big question for people, isn't it? Don't you think that?
Well, I think that's a very, very big question in economy. And I think I would personally start putting that issue on the table. I mean, in some way, the company that I would like to have, it's a company that would have open accountabilities and actually limit on profit. And I like to live well. So my limit would be public and wouldn't be that low. That's a kind of dreamer,
Okay, we're coming to the end of this session. So
okay, yes.
It's a good point that people do have to think about that, how and what sort of person they are and what sort of relationships, and maybe bring that more in. Okay, thanks, Miguel. If you can switch the camera and microphone off. Great. Okay. Thanks very much, Dave. And I will be putting this up as quickly as possible because we're going to be sharing it again later. And we're chatting a bit later. But otherwise, everyone, we'll come back. We're a bit late, so we'll start again at 9:05. That's 7 minutes. Okay. Thanks very much, all. Bye.